South Africa aims to introduce carbon taxation in the 2013-2014 tax year. We kick off this week's show looking at green business and how organizations can use their IT infrastructure more efficiently. SustainableIT helps organizations to cut their CO2 emissions through PC power management and other tools. Joining me now from our Cape Town studios, I have Tim James, founder and director of SustainableIT. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hi, Natasha.
Now, the concept of going green, at least from an IT perspective, has been around for some time. But do CIOs and IT managers truly understand the value of the concept?
I wouldn't say they are mature yet within the South African context. If you look globally around the agenda of the CIO, energy efficiency and CO2 emissions is squarely on their agenda in terms of managing and reducing within those organizations. In South Africa, we're still a bit immature. CIOs are not actively managing this. And I think as a result of rising energy costs and, as you said, carbon taxation, this is getting higher up the corporate agenda, but certainly not where it should be if you look at it globally.
But we are at that tipping point. We've seen carbon tax legislation extensively being implemented in Australia, hitting a lot of companies' bottom line. As we said, South African government planning to implement that in a year or so. Is that what it takes, that I have to hit you over the fingers with a rod to make you understand the value? Because it's only when it hits your bottom line that you go, oh, I should have done this a while ago.
I think unfortunately that is true. I mean, when we look at organizations, and we certainly speak about the triple bottom line of people, profit and planet, and unfortunately if you go into an organization and start talking about green IT or sustainable computing, the eyes really glaze over. It's here's another bunny hugger. But ultimately this is really around saving costs. Saving energy saves costs, reduces CO2 emissions. So if it's got to be carbon taxation that does this, which is obviously going to have an impact on the bottom line, that's probably the way it's going to happen. We've actually got business in Australia, and it's quite phenomenal how the uptake of this in Australia compared to South Africa directly as a result of legislation is causing that to happen.
Let's take a look at some of your top tips to green IT operations. Number one, you list as make the CIOs responsible. Shouldn't they be responsible in any case?
They should, but they're not. It's as simple as that. I mean, CIOs, unfortunately, they're not responsible. We are starting to see a couple of corporates making the CIO responsible, particularly for energy, which is a global trend. We've seen some large retailers make the CIO responsible. And as soon as that happens and they've got a KPI, they start actively measuring and doing something about this. But until that happens, I think we're not going to see much change in this space.
But does that also mean that it needs to come from the top, perhaps from the chief financial officer, CEO, instructing the CIO to take this over?
Absolutely. I mean, we did a lot of work with one of the 4 major banks recently. We put a power management solution in across about 37,000 workstations. And there was a lot of exec commitment and drive from the top downwards, which made that project happen. We've seen in other organizations where that hasn't been the case, where these kinds of activities just filter into nothing.
Let's take a look at tip 2, determining your carbon footprint. How can companies find out what exactly their carbon footprint is?
Well, I mean, if you look at the JSE Top 100, most of those organizations already today do reporting in terms of the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a voluntary initiative. There is an international standard to report carbon, which is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So it's not actually that difficult to get an understanding of your carbon footprint. There are consultants and there are tools available that allow you to do that. And the reason why we talk about that is because unless you've got a baseline from which to measure against, you can't really put any sort of program or projects together to actually start reducing your emissions. So get your carbon footprint measured, understand where you are, and then start to come up with a demonstrable plan to reduce it.
Now, you mentioned the CDP is voluntary at the moment. Do you think that at some point we'll get to that stage, especially in a South African context? We know companies have to report on BEE standards. Do you think that we'll get to that level where CDP becomes a way of life when it comes to auditing and reflecting what's going on in the company?
I don't necessarily think it'll be CDP, but I do think, or we're already starting to see a trend where from a procurement point of view, companies are being asked what are their environmental credentials. Certainly the bigger corporates are asking the smaller suppliers to provide information and disclosure around their environmental credentials, their carbon footprint. And we actually do some work in this space for smaller companies so that they can understand and report these to the larger corporates. There's no doubt with carbon taxation that getting a better grasp of your carbon footprint is going to become extremely important, because there's risk associated with that carbon footprint, and if you're not starting to embrace a low carbon future, from a sustainability point of view, your business could be under threat.
Let's take a look at some of the simple things you can do to cut down your carbon footprint. I see one of the things you've listed here is turn your PCs off at night. Such a small thing, but very few companies actually pull through on this.
Yeah, it's a bit of an immaturity, really, from an IT administrative perspective in South Africa. There are tools available for administrators to power infrastructure down and then power it up again automatically and remotely so that they can do their patching and security updates. These kinds of tools have not really been embraced in South Africa, and they've been around for 15 odd years globally. So it is a very simple thing. I mean, if you go to bed at night, you turn your lights off, you should be turning things off that you're not using. It's absolutely as simple, as straightforward as that.
Little steps. Let's take a look at the last 2 points. Get rid of the servers you don't need and optimize the servers that you do. How big a role does a concept like the cloud play in this, taking away that solid infrastructure?
Well, I think the cloud has got its ups and its downs. The concept of the cloud is good and sound. The challenge, I think, is that you're still going to be running your physical processing somewhere, whether it be in the cloud or whether it be on your own premises. What we say to people wanting to go to the cloud is make sure you go to a cloud provider that is not only running their infrastructure efficiently, but is also potentially using renewable energy. So you see the likes of Google, Amazon, Microsoft getting into this space where they're providing cloud services, but they're using renewable energy in the back end, which is obviously a very good thing. If you're using a cloud provider that's not necessarily using renewable energy, I'm not saying don't use them, but just make sure that they are running an optimal cloud service and not just effectively taking your infrastructure and running it elsewhere.